All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for today's budget webinar, all about leveraging budget cycles to drive your fines and fees advocacy reform. My name is Lillian Patil. I am the Senior Analyst for State and Local Budgets at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, or FFJC. FFJC is a resource, information, and advocacy hub working with partners across the country to help end government practices of profiting off people who are involved in the criminal legal system through the unfair imposition and collection of fines and fees at basically every aspect of that system, and using revenue streams from fines and fees to generate budget revenue. So today we're going to be talking about budget cycles because for many of the states that you all are in, and many local jurisdictions too, although we have just entered a new budget and a new fiscal year for most of you on July 1st, states and local jurisdictions are already, for the most part, gearing up and starting a pretty standard budget development cycle to get ready for the next fiscal year. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk through some of the nuts and bolts of what it means to go through a typical state or local budget development cycle and what opportunities there are for advocates to engage with different stakeholders and decision makers and use the different tools that come out of each stage to give yourself the power to access and participate in the budget, and by doing so, giving yourself the power to push forward and maximize the effectiveness of your fines and fees reform campaign. Before I started with FFJC, I spent about 5 years working in state and local executive official budget offices. And in these roles, my primary job each time was to help lead and manage this annual standard budget development cycle to help build public budgets for each new fiscal year. And I pretty quickly realized that the budgets themselves and the budget cycles to develop them are an incredibly powerful tool, an incredibly powerful way for both legislators, elected officials, and stakeholders and advocates to be able to push for change, to change a status quo, and to lift up the most priority investments and values that a jurisdiction should hold. And so today we're going to really dig into how to do that at a very concrete level. So we'll start off with just a quick primer on why public budgets are so powerful for creating change and for advocates to be able to access. And then we'll dive right into nuts and bolts of 4 concrete stages of your typical state and local budget cycle. After we do that, we'll talk a little bit about some pros and cons of what it means to try and advance a fines and fees campaign or reform through the budget itself versus through a standalone bill in legislative session. And then we'll make sure, as always, to leave some time at the end for questions. You can also feel free as we go through, if you have questions on a particular slide, as we go through, you can pop your questions into the Q&A chat. Our wonderful comms team is helping us monitor that. And I will try and answer questions as I go through. If I don't get to any of them on the slide itself, I'll make sure that we leave some time at the end for those questions. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. And so after we are done, we'll be putting it up on our FFJC YouTube channel, where you'll be able to access it for free anytime. And you can also check out on that YouTube channel several other budget webinars that we have done about different types of budget topics in the past and how they relate to fines and fees advocacy strategies. All right, so let's get started with a quick primer, which may be a review for those of you who have seen prior webinars. But a good primer for those of you who may be tuning in for the first time. So why should advocates care about public budgets, and why did I just say they are so powerful? Essentially, public budgets are the concrete manifestation of the power that stakeholders and lawmakers have to map and to shape policy values, and in doing so, to decide and set the status quo for the highest priority values and policies that a jurisdiction and that a government carries out. And I say this because of a couple big things to know about budgets and governments. The first big thing is that almost everything that happens in government either raises or spends public money. So on the raising money side, on the revenue side, you have collections for tolls on bridges. You have assessment and collections of fines and fees. You have collections every year of annual taxes. And on the spending side, almost everything that happens in government takes money to implement, whether that's doing infrastructure projects and improving roads, or implementing grants and programs and services on an annual basis, or hiring and paying people to carry out all of those programs and all the different things that government does across a huge number of agencies, issue areas, and investments. And what that means is because almost everything in government raises or spends money, that means almost everything in government that happens in government ends up being included in your public budget and appropriated or legally authorized for spending in your public budget. So budgets end up incorporating almost everything that goes on in government. Even more than that, budgets are also built as a comprehensive snapshot in time. And that's because they're through this typical standard budget development cycle. When you are planning out a budget for the next fiscal year, at a certain moment in time, you're looking ahead for the entire next fiscal year to try and figure out how much money is going to come in and how much money needs to be spent across all of the different agencies and all of the different activities that go into running a government. And what you end up with in your final budget is a giant comprehensive map where you can not only see everyone who's getting money and doing and raising money and doing things in government, but you can also see a comparable view of who's getting what money. So you can see how a certain agency is funded compared to another agency at the same moment in time, in the same snapshot. And that allows you to see priorities that are higher or lower than each other when you're looking at different issue areas, investments, agencies that may be funded more or less than others. And then the last thing, I don't know why they all say one, but the last thing I wanted to point out here is that balanced budgets force trade-offs. At the state and local level, budgets must be balanced. And that means that you can only spend as many dollars as you're bringing in revenue. And so when you're planning out and then finalizing and passing a budget, you have a fixed pot of money with which to work, with which to then allocate or assign out all of those dollars to be spent in different ways by different agencies on different activities. And you have to prioritize who is going to get those dollars and what investments are going to get those dollars and what's not going to make the cut. And so as opposed to, campaigns, and sometimes when legislators are talking to constituents, they may be able to say, yes, I support this idea. I support this investment. This is a wonderful idea, which all may be true. But when it comes time to budget development and finalization, lawmakers are forced to make very concrete trade-offs because there is that fixed amount of money. You can't fund everything. And so when the budget is finalized, what you can do by accessing and reading the budget is you can see how those trade-offs have played out, and you can see at a very concrete level what your lawmakers consider to be highest priority or maybe not as high priority if they did not make it into the budget or funded at a lower level. And so with all those things combined about budgets, what you get at the end of the day is an incredibly powerful tool to not only see the landscape of how a jurisdiction is valuing and prioritizing different issues and investments, but you can also compare that across an entire jurisdiction and government. And then if you are able to, as an advocate, meaningfully engage with the people who are making decisions about the budget and access the different stages of those budgets, you give yourself power to shape that picture and shape creating policy change in that picture. And that is what we are going to talk about today. So a quick review of some technical budget basics and your basic building blocks that make up budgets. First, of course, you have your revenue. This is the money that comes into governments every year. And usually in every jurisdiction, there's some sort of revenue forecasting body that at various points during the year projects out or makes assumptions about what kind of money is going to come in and how much of each type of public money or revenue stream that the government can depend on for the entire next fiscal year. These are, of course, assumptions because you're looking into the future. And so when you program them in the budget, they are called projections. An important thing to note about different types of revenue, some of the revenue that comes in is not discretionary or it's earmarked. These are your federal dollars that are coming from the federal government and must be used specifically for certain federal programs or different types of implementation or other types of special funds or special revenue types that can include fines and fees if statute sets it up that way that are earmarked and can only be used for very specific activities. But a big portion of revenue that comes into both state and local budgets is what we call general fund or general revenue money. And these pots are primarily made up of your general tax basis. So your income tax, your sales tax, your corporate tax, your property tax. And when these dollars come into the general fund, once they hit the general fund, they lose their individual quote unquote flavor of money and they just become a dollar in the general fund. Sometimes fines and fees revenue comes into the general fund too, again, depending how statute sets it up and dictates where that collected money should go. The big swirling pot of general fund is the big pot of money that lawmakers have the most discretion to decide how to allocate or assign it out in the budget and legally authorize different agencies to use that general fund. So I bring this up because when you're participating in the budget cycle and you're hearing conversations about lawmakers trying to do trade-offs about what to do with the different amount of money they have to play with, they're probably often talking about that general fund pot because that's their really discretional source of money that lawmakers can decide to put anywhere they want to any agency, to any type of activity or government operation. And then once the revenue dollars come in and you know how much you think you can depend on or project, you can then designate correspondingly those dollars to be spent in different ways. And we call those spending dollars expenditures. And so in public budgets, lawmakers assign or allocate and appropriate or legally authorize different agencies to use those different revenue dollars as expenditures for specific activities. So by putting them into technical funds and sub-funds and budget codes at a technical level. And this is what enables, of course, the implementation of all the things that government needs money in order to do, and all the different ways that government needs money to run. And then because budgets must be balanced at the state and local level, at the end of the day in your final budget, your projected number of revenue dollars must equal your projected number of expenditure dollars. And that, again, means you have a fixed pot and you cannot spend more money than you are projecting to have. When your budget is planned out and finalized, those dollars for revenues and expenditures are all called projections because you're making assumptions and expectations of what you're going to see in the future for an entire fiscal year. When the dollars actually come in at the end of the day and the dollars are actually spent, at the end of the fiscal year, that all gets totaled up and you get something called actuals. And as advocates, and particularly as fines and fees advocates, it can be really helpful to look at and compare what actuals are looking like compared to projections. For example, if you're looking at a fines and fees revenue stream and you look at what was projected and there were $10 million projected to come into the government from, I don't know, a public defender fee that gets assessed for people applying for public defenders. And then you look at actuals and you see that only $5 million was collected, that can give you good evidence to say, this is an unreliable fee stream because it actually has a lower collection rate than the government was originally depending on. So this is no good for our budget as well as no good for our residents, for the people who are incurring that debt and those assessed dollars. One last thing I want to bring up about technical budget basics before we move forward is the concept of incremental budgeting, which is the way that every state and local jurisdiction that I know of builds their budget. And what this means is when a state or local government goes to build their next year's budget, they don't look at and have direct conversations about every single one of the often billions and billions of dollars that makes up the entire budget. Because just practically speaking, with the number of months or weeks that lawmakers have to do this process, there just isn't time. And so instead, what generally happens is the trade-off conversations and the work around building the budget revolves instead around the change from the previous budget. So for example, if your fiscal revenue forecasting body comes to you and says, oh, for the next fiscal year, great news, we think we're going to have $10 million more in revenue than we have this year, then your trade-offs and your conversations in building that budget are likely going to consist around how to spend that $10 million and what to do with that budget growth, that change from last year, instead of looking at all whatever $1 billion that may make up the entire budget. On the flip side, if your revenue forecasting body comes back and says, ooh, things are getting tighter in terms of revenue, we think we're going to have $5 million less in revenue than we do in the current year. Then your budget conversations are going to look very different, and they're going to focus around how do we cut existing spending in this year's budget by 5 million so that next year's budget can still be balanced to that lower amount of revenue. Or how do we come up with other new forms of revenue or reallocate our current revenue in a way that allows us to maintain our current spending. But again, looking directly in comparison to what has happened in the previous budget. That is often when budgets come out, how you will see the fiscal health or sort of the characteristics of the budget framed is in terms of what's new from last budget. So the budget has grown 5% from last year, or budget spending has shrunk 10% from the previous year. That is generally the framing that we look at budgets when we're doing this development cycle. And we'll talk about in a while why that becomes important when you're thinking about trying to implement a fines and fee reform through the budget, because it can help you really make sure that that reform, if it's implemented in the budget, is durable, because each year's fiscal year budget becomes the base or the status quo for the next year. So we'll touch on that a little bit more later. The very last technical thing I want to go over is just to make sure that everyone has a good sense of the way that we talk about and name fiscal years. So fiscal years generally incorporate 2 different calendar years. And for most state and local jurisdictions, they run July 1st to June 30th. There are some exceptions, but most have this particular fiscal year. And when we talk about naming fiscal years, it generally starts off fiscal year or FY, and then a number a year after it. And that year represents the second of the 2 calendar years that it incorporates. So for example, right now we just hit August 2024. And so we just started on July 1st of this year, a new fiscal year. That fiscal year will run from July 1st, 2024, all the way until June 30th of next year, 2025. And so we call this fiscal year or FY, and then the second of those 2 calendar years, 2025. That's the fiscal year we're in right now. On July 1st of next year, a new fiscal year will start. And that fiscal year will go all the way until June 30th of 2026. We call that fiscal year 2026. And that's the budget that most of your jurisdictions are either already starting to work on or will be starting to work on very shortly. Okay, so now that we've gotten some of those technical basics out of the way, let's get right into the 4 concrete stages that I've pulled out here of your typical state or local public budget cycle. Stage 1 is a stage that for many of your state jurisdictions and probably also many of your local jurisdictions are already in right now. I know we just started a new fiscal year, but usually budgets are passed, everyone takes a very short breath, and then the next stage for planning the next budget cycle kicks off very shortly after, because budget planning just takes so long. It must be done usually up to or sometimes even a little bit more than a year in advance. So this first stage, at each stage, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happens at this stage, who are the major stakeholders in this stage that are making decisions about the budget, to give you some ideas on how your fines and fees reform campaign could most effectively engage and strategize to engage with that particular stage and the people who have power at that stage to make decisions and hopefully get your proposal incorporated in the budget. So this first stage is called budget guidance released. And this kicks off usually summer or early fall. And your major stakeholders here are your budget director, which usually sits in an office under the executive official, so under the mayor or the governor, and then your agency directors. And this stage usually kicks off with a revenue forecasting body creating an updated projection or look at what's going to happen in terms of revenue for that new fiscal year, for that new budget that we're starting to build. And so they're going to look and see if revenue is expected to grow or shrink from each source, again, compared to the current fiscal year we're in right now. Once they have that revenue picture, they give it to the budget director and the executive official. And the budget director and executive officials, your mayor or governor, use that updated picture to help understand what kind of budget building year it's going to be. Is there going to be a lot of wiggle room to do new things because there's a lot of new revenue to work with? Or is it going to be a tighter year where the budget's going to have to shrink because revenue is shrinking? And so conversations are going to have to focus on either maintaining current services or cutting spending in some way. And the budget director and the mayor and the governor then use that picture and that understanding to start to map out a very broad strategy for how they're going to balance the budget that year, whether they're looking at an expected deficit that they're going to close, where spending is going to be more than revenue, so you have to cut spending, or whether there's going to be a lot of new revenue to work with. And usually how they start to frame that general plan is coming up with some very specific quantitative targets that they will then ask agency directors to hit when they make their official proposals for change to their agency budgets. And those targets will tell agency directors, you can submit whatever proposals you would like to change your budget, however many you would like, but at the end of the day, the overall change that you are requesting to your budget compared to this year, again, looking incrementally, must be no more than 3% increase over the current year. Or if we're focusing on cutting spending, they might require all agency directors to submit a plan that would identify savings or reduced spending of 3%. And basically, the executive official and the budget director are counting on needing all agencies to do that and hit their target in order to get them to a place where they can incorporate, other fiscal strategies, but then get to a balanced budget at the end of the day. Once that formal guidance goes out, the power sort of passes to agencies and agency directors to then decide amongst themselves, amongst their own agency, what they would like to prioritize in terms of new changes they want to see in their budget within the guidelines of those given targets. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of what budget guidance looks like. These examples are both from the state of Georgia. The first one I'm going to show you is their fiscal 2025 budget and the language used in this official memo. So this is from the governor of Georgia, and you'll see that this letter starts out with some good news. It talks about the underlying strength of the state economy. And as a result of that underlying strength and probably decent revenue picture, it specifically says that agencies may request budget enhancements or increases of up to 3% above the current budget for both the current and next fiscal years. It also even says agencies are invited to share other ideas for one-time investment opportunities. And that means that is sort of like a signal to me that there is additional one-time revenue, so revenue that's coming in for 1 year, but they don't expect to get every year, that could be used for very specific one-time investments where you need the money for 1 year, like a capital project or an infrastructure project, and then it's done, as opposed to like needing payroll year after year to hire a new person, or needing a certain amount of money year after year after year to run a recurring grant program. So pretty good news in this budget instructions memo for fiscal year 2025. Then we look to Georgia's 2026 budget instructions, which came out very recently. And again, these are public. I just had to Google Georgia fiscal year 2026 budget instructions. And this tone is a little bit different. So same memo setup, but here you see the governor saying, Georgia's going to need to prioritize conservative fiscal management. So it's not talking about the underlying strength of the state economy anymore. It's more saying we need to be fiscally responsible, which signals to me that maybe there isn't as much revenue projected to be able to play with and do new things with in this next budget as there was in fiscal year 2025. And so the specific instruction to agencies here is that agencies should plan to maintain their current spending levels in the current fiscal year for the upcoming budget cycle. So the target is basically 0% growth. However, a little bit later in the memo, they do provide like a little bit of wiggle room for agencies. They say if your agency has a new workload need or a specific initiative that would result in service improvement and out year savings that you haven't previously discussed, like go ahead and discuss this with your OPB analyst, which is their state budget office. And so even though they're saying, don't do new things, please, they're saying if there's something that is really high priority, if it must be done in order for your agency to be successful, have the conversation with your budget office. At this stage in the budget cycle, the power has not yet shifted to the budget office. The power is still with agencies who are deciding what to propose, but it's kind of foreshadowing the really high level of power that budget offices have, because even though these sort of strict instructions and very like quantitative targets are given, there is always in budget development some room around the edges, some gray area where something has to be figured out in the whole big swirling pot of general fund changes and funding changes that makes up the entire budget development cycle, that may lie outside of the official budget instructions. And budget offices are often the office where you can have those conversations and that can bring those recommendations, even if they don't totally fit within budget instructions. So that's an interesting example right there. So agencies from this point then take the budget instructions and decide amongst their agencies what priority initiatives, investments, and budget changes that they want to see. And again, what they're really doing here is not just proposing budget changes, but they're really deciding and proposing what they want their policies and values to be for the next year as an agency, because almost every way that you implement policies and values in government takes or raises money. And when agencies submit these proposals, they're often done in an official way. This is most often done at the state level, sometimes at the local level too, but often agencies have to submit their proposals in the form of these narrative decision packages. So this is a template also from Georgia, where agencies, when they submit their proposals, they have to fill out, for each proposal, they have to fill out this template that asks them not only what would you like to change about your budget and how much money will the change amount be, but why are you doing this? What is the need to change your budget in this way? What policy impact will it have? Who will it help? Is it redundant of anything else that's happening in the budget already? And these templates can be really useful if they are public. They are not always public, or sometimes they're like hard to find publicly. But if you can, they can be a really useful way to see the overall landscape and like thinking behind the agencies at this stage of the budget process of what they see as most important for their agency to be able to maintain and carry out or expand in some way through these budget proposals. This is also a really good time, if you have relationships with the agency that collects or spends down the fines or fees that you're interested in reforming or eliminating, this is a really good time to engage with the agency and to relationship build and to see if there's any way that you can get the proposal you want to see included as one of the official proposals submitted by the agency as part of the net target. The reason for that is once these proposals are submitted, they move to the budget office, who then reviews them and makes recommendations on each official proposal to the executive official, the mayor or governor. So if you can get your proposal in through this stage of the budget process as an agency proposal, you're almost guaranteeing that it will in some way be reviewed and a recommendation will be made on by the executive office at some point in the budget process. Just going to check for questions here. What about cities with city managers? That's a great question. So at local jurisdictions, who is considered like the executive branch and the creator of this initial proposed budget varies based on how your local government is set up. So in places where it's a strong mayor city, then you're almost always going to see the mayor in charge of building out these budget processes. In some cases where the city managers hold a lot of power and it's not a strong mayor city, you may see the city manager in charge of this budget development process, and you may see the budget office sitting under the city manager. I would say it's most common to see the mayor being in charge of this, but I have seen in some cases city managers. Okay, so once agencies submit these proposals, then we move to stage 2, which is the agency proposal review. And this happens usually in the fall and early winter. So I've seen a lot of state deadlines in particular around like September and October for agencies submitting their proposals. So that's again, just for thinking about where we are right now in the fiscal year. That's like now-ish would be the time to collaborate and try and work with agencies if you know that agencies are preparing proposals and you want to try and get your proposal in through that stage. So after they're submitted, then budget offices kind of take the helm of decision-making and work power, and they start going through each proposal. And this is usually a set of budget office analysts, each of whom has a portfolio of several different agencies. And so they're in charge of reading and analyzing each of the proposals that comes through from each of the agencies in their portfolio. And they're reviewing and analyzing them not only for just what's the fiscal impact. So that's very important, of like, how much money would this raise or cost, and how does that play into the overall balancing picture? Because at the end of the day, the job of the budget office is to balance the budget. And so there's serious fiscal considerations for each proposal, but then there's also policy considerations. And that's looking at, what is the justification for this proposal? What would it add to the policy impact that this agency has? What would it add to the policy goals of the mayor or the governor or the city manager and of the jurisdiction, jurisdiction-wide? Who would it impact, and would it impact priority populations? These are all questions that the budget office is looking at for all of these different proposals. And then at the same time, there may be side proposals that are coming in through conversations with legislators who don't have direct power and decision-making power yet, but certainly indirectly are having conversations with the budget office, having conversations with with the executive office, to make sure that, you know, all proposals for all residents are considered at this time. And this is when things are just changing wildly in terms of the balanced budget and how much general fund is available and how much general fund is being taken up every day. Just on the day-to-day, things can change a lot because there are so many proposals being considered. And for each proposal, the budget office usually makes an official recommendation to the mayor or the governor or city manager, saying, we think this deserves a spot in the budget. We think this one doesn't make the cut. At the end of the day, the elected official is, the executive office official is in charge of making those decisions of what goes into and out of the budget. And the budget director is in charge of making sure that final budget is balanced. Again, that expenditures equal revenue. And so this is a time when you have your budget office staff and your budget director doing a huge amount of work here to make recommendations and decisions about what's in and what's out. Again, depending on a lot of policy considerations and fiscal considerations. And so this is a stage where, as an advocate, if you have access and you have relationships with and a way to engage with folks in the budget office and folks in the executive office, this is a great time to do that because they have direct decision-making power here. I will also say, as someone who was a budget analyst in multiple of these offices for several years, that this is a time when it can be helpful for budget office analysts to get expertise or information from agencies or sometimes from advocates to help them do their analysis and make recommendations. Because each budget analyst is usually in charge of portfolio of a number of departments, and that can change from year to year, you're not always going to have someone who has a ton of expertise in an agency that they are responsible for reviewing the proposals and making recommendations. And so what that means is you all as advocates have a ton of expertise and information about, for example, the incredible and disproportional harm that current fines and fees practices has on certain populations, and the incredibly positive impact on communities, on local economies, that eliminating those harmful fines and fees revenue streams can have. And so if you have any way through like a meeting with the budget office or sending over a one-pager to get some information over to the budget office who is analyzing a proposal, if it's been submitted at that point, or to get your proposal in the budget office's ear for consideration, this is a really good time to do it. There's some budget offices that I know of where any organization or any advocates or any person can request a meeting with the budget office. That's not the case in all jurisdictions that I know of. But again, if you do have the opportunity, it can be a really valuable time to have that engagement and to help share some of that information and expertise that you all have as fines and fees advocates. I would also put in a personal pitch here. If you do end up talking to someone from a budget office, please be kind, because often this work involves a lot of nights and weekends, nonstop work for months on end as they're trying to get all of these often hundreds of proposals read and analyzed and in a place where the budget ends up being balanced. And so being kind can go a long way and is always appreciated by budget office staff at this point for sure. At the end of the day, what you hopefully end up with by the time the proposed budget is due is a balanced budget that incorporates some amount of these proposals into what is the governor or mayor's or city manager's final proposed budget, and that budget gets released. This usually happens around January or February, right before or right as legislative session is starting. That's no coincidence because once the budget is released, it becomes an official piece of legislation. Like any other piece of legislation, that must be reviewed, amended, and then passed by the legislature in a legislative session. At the local level, this can happen a lot quicker than at the state level, because at the local level, you often don't have these like full blown out legislative sessions that you have at the state level. So that can take a certain amount of time. But before we even move into that legislative stage, I gave the release of this budget, of the proposed budget, its very own stage. And that's because there's a lot happening at this point. When the budget is released, it becomes this official piece of legislation, and it wraps up in a hopefully balanced way all of the different investments and programs and funding that has been deemed by the executive office and agencies to be highest priority. And so it should be a reflection of the most deeply held values and priority of the entire jurisdiction. And in this way, because it's this comprehensive map that's showing everything, it becomes a messaging tool and a really concrete manifestation of the values of both the officials who built the budget and of the jurisdiction itself. And so around the time when this budget is passed, is proposed and released, it is also no coincidence that it's usually very close to the time when the state of the state or state of the city speeches also happen. And if you listen to those speeches, you will almost always hear a lot of callbacks to what is going on in what is funded in the budgets as concrete evidence that mayors and governors use to show that they are fulfilling on the promises they made to their constituents. So for example, if you have a mayor that's saying, I am an affordable housing mayor, they may call back and make sure that in their proposed budget is X million dollars of funding for new permanent supportive housing units, or X million of dollars in new funding for a new program that provides down payment assistance, whatever the case may be. Having those concrete funding initiatives in the budget is how elected officials often prove at this point that they are doing what they said they would do in their campaigns to their constituents. And so it becomes a powerful messaging tool. As an advocate, it can be really helpful to listen for that messaging and pay attention to how that messaging is framed, what's in, what's out, and what kind of policies and values those decisions represent, so that you can, if you are still at this point trying to get your fines and fees reform into the next stage of the budget during the legislative review section, or trying to work with executive officials to get it in next time around, or looking to get it in as a standalone bill later in legislative session, you can kind of use that messaging and that rhetoric to align with your own campaign messaging to sort of lift up and show commonality between what's prioritized in the budget and what your reform would do, to show why it belongs with the rest of the budget and why it really belongs in the same space as all these other investments. Okay, so the budget gets released. Along with the release of the actual budget, which again is a very long piece of legislation, is almost always a proposed budget book. These are public. They usually are done in person, so like actual thick books, and also can be found online just by Googling whatever jurisdiction proposed budget book. And they create a very high level narrative, both as an overall, as a general overview of the jurisdiction, and then by agency or by issue area of what's changing in the new budget compared to previous budgets. Again, always looking incrementally. And those budget books can be a treasure trove of information and data that can help you both understand what's in and what's out of the budget, or if you're not looking for a specific thing to be in or out of the budget, can also just help you understand overall the policy landscape and the values landscape of what's going on for the next fiscal year. I'm not going to say more than that about budget books, because we actually have an entire previous budget webinar that focuses only on budget books and goes into a lot of detail about all the different sections you usually find in budget books and all the different things that you can pull out and learn from budget books. Our wonderful comms team has linked that webinar in the chat, so feel free to check that out if you want to learn more about budget books. But for now, we'll move on to what happens after the budget is proposed and budget books are released, which is our last stage, which is legislative session and legislative review. This usually happens in late winter or spring. In local jurisdictions, in my experience, it happens a lot faster than in state jurisdictions where there's an entire legislative session and the budget process can last for a lot of that session. And your major stakeholders and your big decision makers here are legislators. This is the point when they have direct power over changing the budget. And so they can make amendments. It still must result in a balanced budget, but they can choose to take dollars away from one planned investment and put them somewhere else if one of their priority funding programs was not included in the proposed budget. And so what they do in order to figure out how to make these decisions is they hold a series of hearings and briefings with each agency, and they bring the agencies forward to usually a joint budget committee of both House and Senate. Or, in local jurisdictions, it might be the overall city council or the overall board of supervisors. And they have agencies report back on what's in their budget currently and what's being proposed to be changed for next year. And so a lot of agencies and the executive official who created this proposed balanced budget are often in the position of wanting to keep the proposed budget as it is because it has their priority stuff in there. And so they're trying to show why this is the best reflection of what the next budget can be. If an agency didn't get what they wanted in the proposed budget, they might come to legislators and say, hey, there's this other thing that we really think should be in the budget. We'd like you to consider amending the budget for this. And so legislators are having a lot of conversations with every single agency and trying to understand the usually hundreds of proposals that have gone into this next budget to change how the budget is looking from one year to this next year. Also, if you are proposing to do something in the budget that changes policy that would need to change statute, you must create accompanying legislation along with the budget legislation, which is what legally authorizes the dollars. You must have this, what's usually called trailing legislation, or sometimes it's called orbital legislation, that changes the statute itself. And so you'll see often a huge amount, often like really dense, can be hundreds of pages of trailing legislation that moves along with the budget. And that's just implementing concretely the policy changes that are reflected in the way that the budget appropriates dollars. That may be different from last year and from prior how statute was set up. And so legislators are doing all these hearings. As an advocate, this is, of course, a really important and useful point of engagement for you if you have legislative partners that you are working with, particularly if you have a legislative partner that is part of the joint budget committee or the committee in the legislature that's specifically making the decisions officially about amendments. Often as part of these budget hearings and briefings, there will be some sort of fiscal staff that the legislature has who will send out specific questions to agencies that legislators may have. And during their hearings, agencies are responsible for coming back and answering those specific questions. So if you are on a quest to, for example, get some data or get some more information about fines and fees collections practices in a particular agency, and you have a legislative partner who would be willing to take the question that you have and incorporate it into one of the questions that's being asked of agencies, maybe that can be a way to get some new information. Or just listening to these hearings and briefings and reading the materials that often accompany them can be, again, a really good way to just get a sense of the overall landscape and policy prioritization that the agency has reflected with the way that the budget has been proposed. And so then legislators make decisions, reallocate money. They can't usually change revenue forecasts. So they can't just say like, oh, we're going to assume there's $10 million more of property tax money this year. But they can say, we're going to cut $10 million from this spending area and move it over to this spending area so that we can incorporate this investment. And then at the end of the day, they pass a final budget, which again must be balanced. And their goal is to pass this final budget before the fiscal year begins, because the budget, this final passed budget, becomes law, becomes current law. And it's what gives agencies not just the dollars, but the legal authority to spend and collect those dollars starting from the beginning of the fiscal year, for most jurisdictions, July 1st. And that's why there have been a couple of cases both in California and New York this past year where they ran right up against their budget deadlines and their fiscal year deadlines and had to pass emergency temporary budgets. And that's why that was such a stressful time for these states, is because agencies need that appropriation through the final passed budget to be able to actually start spending down dollars to pay their employees to carry out their programs. Once that budget has been passed, there's also limited ability that agencies have to change the way that the dollars are programmed to be spent. And that's because each dollar that's appropriated or assigned in the budget gets coded in this technical budget structure into funds and subfunds and activity codes that dictate exactly how that dollar should be spent, on what activity, on what operation, on what type of payroll activity. And there's some technical level at which agencies can kind of reallocate that to just address needs as they arise throughout the fiscal year, because reality happens and we can't perfectly predict what's needed in the future. But they can't move around large chunks of money or totally change the way that the money they've been given is implemented unless they do a mid-year piece of legislation to officially and legally amend the budget, which is called a mid-year supplemental, which happens, but it's not super common. And so once a budget is finalized and passed, that essentially becomes what the plan is for raising and spending money for the entire next fiscal year. And so that essentially, because this is the concrete manifestation of policies and investments, the past budget really sets the plan for what a government's going to do and what policies it's going to prioritize for the entire next fiscal year. And so if you have passed that last stage of budget, if you have just gotten past legislative session and you still didn't get the reform that you wanted through the legislature or into the budget, at this point, you're probably going to want to start looking ahead to next year and to next year's budget. But as we've shown in stage one, that next stage starts very soon after the new fiscal year begins. And so it's just this constant cycle of looking ahead to the next budget and next projections and seeing where it might make the most sense for you to engage to try and incorporate your reform in that budget. So that is your budget cycle. The last thing I want to touch on before we stop for questions is some pros and cons of trying to pass a fines and fees reform campaign, so change a finer fee revenue stream through the budget itself, which is kind of what we've been talking about with this budget cycle, versus through standalone legislation in legislative session or standalone ordinance at the local level. And there's some pros and cons to both. Some pros of passing your reform through the budget. One has to do with durability. Do you remember back when I introduced this idea of incremental budgeting? The fact that each year's budget becomes the base or the status quo for next year's budget means once you make a change to a budget, it becomes part of next year's base. And that makes undoing changes hard. So if you can eliminate a fine or a fee revenue stream in a budget, the next year, that same revenue stream will still be eliminated unless it was specifically marked as like a one-time only change, which is not the norm. And so you don't have to worry about having to make sure you keep that reform in there unless you have a legislature who specifically wants to go back and pull it back out. So what that means is that changes that happen through the budget can often be very durable because of this nature of incremental budgeting. Also, as we've talked about throughout this whole cycle, there are generally hundreds of proposals that are coming through at one time during this one process to build this one budget and one piece of legislation that gets passed. And so if you have a finer fee reform that you are advocating for, and you think that politically it would be favorable for this reform to not get a ton of attention and kind of just slip through a process, then the budget may be a good vehicle for you to use, because there's so much being talked about during the budget process and during these trade-off conversations that you may be able to avoid the political spotlight for focusing so much on this one particular change and just see it as one of many agency changes in whatever agency would be implementing the finer fee change. And you don't always have to do these one-for-one trade-offs. So during the budget cycle, each new proposal, you're not looking at it like this will cost $3 million. Where am I going to find $3 million? You're more looking at it as this is a proposal that would cost $3 million. Where does it land in my long list of proposals that would all take up money? Would it fit high enough in that priority list that it could fit within the overall swirling giant pot of general fund that we have to work with? And then one more thing to know about a pro of passing a reform through the budget is as you saw in the budget cycle, the executive branch generally has a lot of power in creating this proposed budget. And then the proposed budget becomes the base or the status quo for what the final budget is going to be. And legislators are just making amendments to that base. There are some states where legislators have a huge amount of power, and the political dynamics are such that the finalized budget ends up looking very different from what the proposed budget's looking like. But there are a lot of states where the governor's proposed budget ends up being, by and large, what gets passed. And there are only sort of like changes around the edges that are made by the legislature. And so depending on the political dynamics in your jurisdiction, and depending on whether you have a strong relationship and collaboration with your executive office, the budget might be a helpful vehicle to try and work with the executive office to make sure it's incorporated into the proposed budget and aligns nicely with the policy agenda that the executive office is trying to highlight and fulfill through the building of the proposed budget. Some cons of passing through the budget where it might make more sense to try and push your reform through a standalone bill in legislative session. If the reform that you're looking at doesn't raise or spend money, it is possible that the reform may not be reflected in the budget, which exists to change the way that money is raised and spent for a new fiscal year. Like I said all the way at the beginning of this presentation, that doesn't happen often, but if it does, and particularly not for fines and fees advocates who often are working with changing very specific revenue streams of fines or fees that are collected. But if that is true for you and your reform, then the budget may not be your way to go. You may be wanting to look at standalone legislation instead. Additionally, if kind of like on the flip side to avoiding the political spotlight, if this is a reform that you think needs a lot of political visibility and conversation and spotlight in order to gain the momentum that's needed to make sure that it is passed and implemented, then sometimes a budget process can hurt rather than help because, again, you're competing with so many other things, other proposals for time and money in these trade-off conversations. And if it's not a good thing for it to get lost a little bit in those conversations, you may want to have it as a standalone bill that stands up on its own, gets its very own time in committee for consideration and conversation specifically and only about that proposal. And then again, we want to think about political dynamics and legislator influence at different stages of the budget process versus executive office influence. And so if your organization or your advocacy campaign has really strong relationships with legislators who really want to champion the bill or champion the reform that you're working on, they may want the ability to sponsor it as a standalone bill so that they can sponsor it, they can champion it, they can lift it up as their bill. Versus if you put something in the budget, again, because everyone's participating at different points in decision-making in this process, it's harder sometimes for legislators to like claim a change as like a change that they have championed because it, again, is incorporated just in this larger budget process. So that, again, just has to do with thinking about the political dynamics of your particular jurisdiction and the existing relationships you have of which stakeholders you are and lawmakers you are already working with and have good relationships with as you work to advance your campaign. All right. That is all we've got for today. So these are the nuts and bolts of the budget cycle. My hope is that you can use some of the concrete tools and engagement points that we've talked about at each point in the cycle to think about where might it make sense for your campaign to engage, try and participate, try and push a reform proposal into a budget so that you can maximize the way that you can use the power of the public budget to advance your fines and fees reform campaigns. With that, I'll pause for questions. We have just a few minutes left. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I'll wait for just a minute. And while we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions, I'll also mention it would be really helpful to us if you all can fill out the very, very, I promise, short feedback survey we've included. That will just help us plan more budget webinars that are useful to you. We want to do more of these, and we want to do what is helpful to you. So you just making a quick note of that, and the feedback is very helpful to us, and we appreciate it. Okay, seeing no other questions, I think we're right at about time. I just want to thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you again for filling out the feedback survey, and we will be back with more budget content for fines and fees advocates. So we look forward to talking to you again.